For 3 years, I walked these hospital corridors in silence, just another nurse on the night shift. Nobody asked questions. Nobody wondered why my hands never shook during the most chaotic emergencies, or why I could stay calm when everyone around me was falling apart. I preferred it that way. But everything changed the day the chief surgeon walked into the break room, looked straight at me, and asked, "Are you Colonel Clara Barton?" The silence that followed was deafening. My colleagues stared at me like they had never seen me before, and maybe they hadn't, because the woman they knew as the quiet night shift nurse had a past I swore I would never reveal. A past of war zones, impossible decisions, and scars that no hospital uniform could hide. My name is Clara Barton, and I am 45 years old. For the last 3 years, I have been working as a registered nurse at St. Michael's Hospital in Portland, Oregon. To everyone here, I am just Clara, the dependable one, the nurse who always volunteers for the difficult shifts, who never complains, who somehow always knows exactly what to do when things go wrong. I live alone in a small apartment downtown, a 10-minute walk from the hospital. My life is quiet, predictable, routine. Every morning at 5:30, I wake up, make coffee, and prepare for my shift. Every evening I come home, eat dinner, read a book, and go to sleep. No drama, no complications, no questions about who I was before I came here. It was a Tuesday morning when everything changed. I was in the break room, finishing my shift paperwork, when Dr. Marcus Harrison walked in. He was the chief of surgery, a man I had worked with dozens of times but never had a real conversation with. He looked at me with an expression I could not quite read, something between recognition and disbelief. "Excuse me," he said, his voice careful. "I have to ask you something. Are you Colonel Clara Barton? The Clara Barton who served in Afghanistan and Iraq?" The pen in my hand stopped moving. I felt every pair of eyes in that room turn toward me. My colleague Jenny, who I had worked alongside for 3 years, actually gasped. I looked up at Dr. Harrison and saw the medical journal in his hand, open to an article about battlefield medicine techniques. There, in the corner of the page, was a photo from 12 years ago. Me, in uniform, standing in a field hospital tent. The room felt smaller suddenly. 3 years of carefully constructed normalcy crumbling in a single moment. I could have denied it. I could have said he was mistaken, but something in his eyes told me he already knew the truth. "Yes," I said quietly. "That was me, a long time ago." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken questions. Dr. Harrison nodded slowly, respect clear in his expression. "I thought so. I read about your work, what you did in Kandahar in 2013. That was remarkable. I did not feel remarkable. I felt exposed, vulnerable in a way I had not felt since I left the military 4 years ago. That was a different life," I managed to say. "I am just a nurse now." But even as I said the words, I knew nothing would be the same again. By the end of that shift, the whispers had already started. The quiet nurse had a secret, and secrets, I have learned, never stay buried forever. If this story has already hooked you, go ahead and subscribe to the channel now, because what comes next will surprise you even more. I grew up in a small town called Longview, Texas, population 3,000, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and nothing ever really changed. My father, James Barton, was a Vietnam veteran. He came home from the war different, quieter, with eyes that sometimes looked at things the rest of us could not see. He did not talk much about what he experienced there, but sometimes, late at night, I would hear him walking through the house, unable to sleep. My mother, Patricia, was a school teacher. She was the steady one, the rock that kept our family anchored when my father's demons tried to pull him under. I was the youngest of 3 children. My brothers, Michael and David, were both athletic and popular. I was the quiet one, the bookish kid who spent more time in the library than on the playground. But I was not weak. My father made sure of that. He taught me how to stay calm under pressure, how to think clearly when everyone else was panicking. "Clara," he used to say, "courage is not about not being afraid. It is about doing what needs to be done even when you are terrified." I did not understand what he meant then. I do now. When I was 17, sitting in my high school library, I found a book about Clara Barton, the founder of the American Red Cross, my namesake. I read about how she went to Civil War battlefields, how she saved lives while bullets flew around her, how she never backed down from doing what was right, even when it was dangerous. Something shifted in me that day. I realized I wanted to do something that mattered, something bigger than myself. 6 months later, 3 days after my 18th birthday, I walked into the Army recruitment office in downtown Longview. My mother cried. My father looked at me for a long time, then nodded once. He understood. I left for basic training in the summer of 2003. I was assigned to the Army Nurse Corps after completing my nursing degree through a military scholarship program. By the time I was 23, I was on a transport plane headed to Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan. I remember looking out the window as we descended, seeing the mountains and dust, and realizing that everything I thought I knew about nursing was about to be tested in ways I could never have imagined. That is where my real education began. Not in a classroom, but in a tent hospital, where the wounded came in waves, where every decision meant life or death, where there was no time for hesitation or doubt. I became someone different in that desert. desperate. Someone harder. Someone who could make impossible choices and live with the consequences. Thank you for staying with me this far. It shows that you feel the same thing I felt when I lived through all of this. So go ahead and subscribe and turn on notifications, because what comes next changes everything. The heat in Afghanistan was unlike anything I had experienced in Texas. It was not just hot, it was suffocating, relentless, the kind of heat that made you dizzy if you stood still too long. Our field hospital was a series of connected tents on the edge of Bagram Airfield, surrounded by concrete barriers and razor wire. The sound of helicopters was constant, a rhythmic thumping that became the soundtrack of my life there. We worked 12-hour shifts, sometimes longer when casualties came in heavy. The wounded arrived covered in dust and blood, their eyes wide with shock and pain. My first week, I assisted in a surgery where we tried to save a young soldier who had stepped on an improvised explosive device. He was 19 years old. His name was Private Tyler Morrison from Ohio. He talked about his girlfriend back home while we worked on him, his voice getting weaker with each word. We lost him after 40 minutes. I went outside after, behind the supply tent, and threw up. Then I washed my face, went back inside, and helped with the next patient. There was no time for grief, no time to process. You just kept moving, but I learned fast. I learned how to control bleeding with minimal supplies. I learned how to triage when there were too many wounded and not enough hands. I learned how to talk to soldiers who knew they were dying, how to hold their hands and make them feel less alone in those final moments. I learned how to compartmentalize, to lock away the emotions until later, to function on adrenaline and necessity. The senior nurses and doctors noticed. Captain Rodriguez, the head nurse, pulled me aside one day after a particularly brutal shift. "You have got something special, Barton," she said. "You do not freeze. Most new nurses take months to develop that kind of composure. You have got it naturally." I did not feel special. I felt numb, but I also felt useful. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Over the months, I earned a reputation. The calm one. The one who could handle anything. When things got chaotic, people looked to me. By my second deployment, I was leading triage during mass casualty events. By my third, I was training newer nurses. I was 26 years old and felt 40. The girl from Longview, Texas, who had been afraid of needles as a child, was now performing emergency procedures in a war zone without flinching. But with every life we saved, there were others we lost. And those losses, they accumulated, like weight on your shoulders that never quite goes away. You just learn to carry it better. Now, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching this story from? Write it in the comments. It is incredible to see people from so many places following stories like this. The promotion came unexpectedly in 2009. I had been in Afghanistan for my 4th deployment, now 29 years old, and a first lieutenant. We were stationed at a forward operating base in Helmand Province, one of the most dangerous regions in the country. The base was small, just a few hundred soldiers, and our medical facility was even smaller. 2 doctors, 3 nurses, and limited supplies. We made do with what we had. That September morning started like any other, hot, dusty, quiet. Then the radio crackled with an emergency. A patrol had been ambushed 5 miles out. Multiple casualties, heavy fire. The helicopters could not get through because of enemy positions. Major Chen, our commanding medical officer, made the decision immediately. "We are going out there. Barton, Rodriguez, you are with me." We loaded the mobile medical truck with supplies and drove out with an armed escort. The sound of gunfire grew louder as we got closer. When we arrived, it was chaos. 3 vehicles destroyed. Soldiers scattered behind whatever cover they could find. The enemy firing from elevated positions in the hills. 8 men were wounded, 2 critically. Major Chen started working on the most critical case while Captain Rodriguez and I handled the others. Bullets were hitting the vehicles around us, kicking up dust, the sharp crack of gunfire constant. I was wrapping a tourniquet on a soldier's leg when I saw Major Chen go down. A bullet had hit him in the shoulder. He was conscious but bleeding heavily, unable to continue. Captain Rodriguez was already overwhelmed with 2 patients. I looked around at the wounded, at the soldiers still fighting, at the impossible situation we were in. Someone had to make decisions. Someone had to take charge, so I did. "Rodriguez, keep those 2 stable. I am taking over triage." I moved to Major Chen, stabilized his wound, then assessed the other casualties. I made the calls. Who needed immediate intervention? Who could wait? Who we could move and who was too unstable? I coordinated with the soldiers to create a better defensive position around the wounded. I talked the helicopter pilot through a dangerous landing under fire, and somehow, impossibly, we got everyone out alive. Back at base, as they were treating Major Chen, the base commander pulled me aside. Lieutenant Colonel Stewart was a hard man, career military, not prone to praise. "What you did out there," he said, "that was leadership under fire. You saved that entire unit. 2 weeks later, I was promoted to captain and given a commendation. But more than that, I was given responsibility. I was now in charge of medical operations for the entire base. At 29 years old, I was making decisions that affected hundreds of lives. And the weight of that responsibility changed me in ways I am still understanding today. The incident that defined my career happened on a cold November night in 2012. I was 32 years old, now a major, stationed at Kandahar Airfield. I had been in Afghanistan on and off for 9 years. I knew the rhythms of war, the patterns, the procedures, but nothing prepared me for what happened that night. We received intelligence about a village 40 miles north, where a school had been hit during fighting. Reports said there were dozens of wounded, including many children. The problem was, the village was in contested territory. Command deemed it too dangerous for a rescue operation. But I had the coordinates, I had the resources, and I had a Hippocratic oath that did not distinguish between safe missions and dangerous ones. I went to Colonel Patterson, the base commander, and requested permission to take a medical team out. He refused. "It is too risky, Major. We do not have air superiority in that sector. I cannot authorize it." I understood his position, but I also understood that children were bleeding out while we had this conversation. I did something I had never done before. I went over his head. I contacted a humanitarian aid organization that was already operating in the region and arranged for their convoy to transport us. Technically, I was on leave for 48 hours. What I did on my personal time was my business. I took 3 volunteers, nurses, and medics who believed in what we were doing, and we joined the aid convoy. We reached the village after sunrise. What we found was worse than the report suggested. The school had taken a direct hit, 37 wounded, including 22 children, some with injuries so severe I knew they would not survive without immediate surgery. We worked for 14 hours straight, no breaks, no rest, using whatever supplies the aid organization had, improvising when we ran out. We saved 28 lives that day. 9 did not make it. When we returned to base, Colonel Patterson was waiting. So was a military police escort. I was placed under immediate investigation for disobeying orders, unauthorized absence, and reckless endangerment. The charges were serious enough to end my career and potentially result in court-martial. But something unexpected happened. The soldiers I had served with for years started speaking up. Letters poured in from people I had treated, people I had trained, people who had served alongside me. The humanitarian organization went public with the story. Suddenly, I was not just a disobedient officer, I was a symbol. The debate raged for months. Was I a hero who saved lives, or a rogue officer who endangered her team? The truth, I think, was both. The court-martial began in March of 2013 at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. I sat in that military courtroom in my dress uniform, facing a panel of 5 senior officers who would decide my fate. The charges were read: willful disobedience of a superior commissioned officer, dereliction of duty, and conduct unbecoming an officer. If convicted, I faced prison time and a dishonorable discharge. Everything I had worked for, gone. The prosecution laid out their case methodically. I had violated the chain of command. I had taken military personnel into a combat zone without authorization. I had risked lives for a mission that was not approved. They were not wrong. I had done all of those things, but what they left out was why. My defense attorney, Captain Lisa Mendez, was relentless. She brought in the 3 volunteers who came with me. Each one testified that they went willingly, that they understood the risks, that they believed it was the right thing to do. She brought in doctors who explained the medical necessity of immediate intervention for the types of injuries we treated. She brought in the families of some of the people we saved, including an Afghan mother who held up a photo of her 8-year-old daughter and said through a translator, "This woman is why my child is alive." The courtroom was packed every day. Active duty soldiers, veterans, civilians. The media covered it extensively. I became a polarizing figure. Some called me a hero. Others called me a dangerous maverick who thought the rules did not apply to her. I did not feel like either. I felt tired. On the 5th day, they called me to testify. The lead prosecutor, Major Williams, was aggressive. "Major Barton, you took an oath to follow orders. Why did you believe you were above that oath?" I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "I took 2 oaths, sir. One to obey orders, one to do no harm. When those 2 oaths conflict, I choose saving lives. Every single time. Even if it means endangering your own people." My people volunteered. Those children did not choose to be in a war zone. The questioning went on for hours. They tried to break me down, to get me to admit I was wrong, but I would not, because I was not wrong. I might have broken protocol, but I had not broken my principles. After 3 weeks, the panel deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the head of the panel, a stern-looking colonel named Henderson, read the verdict. On the charge of willful disobedience, we find the defendant guilty. However, given the extraordinary circumstances and the lives saved, we recommend leniency. I was given a formal reprimand, reduced in rank to captain temporarily, and ordered to complete additional leadership training. But I was not discharged. I could continue serving. As I left that courtroom, I did not feel victorious. I felt hollow, because I knew something had fundamentally changed. I was no longer just an officer. I was controversial. And in the military, controversy is a burden you carry forever. After the court-martial, I was reassigned to Walter Reed Medical Center in Washington, D.C. It was 2013. I was 33 years old, and for the first time in a decade, I was not in a war zone. The adjustment was harder than I expected. Walter Reed was a world-class facility, state-of-the-art equipment, plenty of staff, no bullets. But I felt restless. The pace was different. The stakes felt lower, even though logically I knew that was not true. The patients here were often veterans dealing with the aftermath of war, traumatic injuries, PTSD, rehabilitation. I understood them in ways many of the other medical staff did not, because I had been there. I had seen what they had seen. Over the next 4 years, I slowly rebuilt my reputation. I focused on developing trauma care protocols, training new military nurses, and working with veterans. In 2015, I was promoted back to major. In 2017, I was promoted to lieutenant colonel and given command of a medical training battalion. And in 2019, at 39 years old, I was promoted to full colonel, the rank I had once thought I would never achieve. But something inside me had shifted. The drive that had pushed me through all those years, the fierce certainty that I was exactly where I needed to be, it was fading. I was tired, not physically, though the years had taken their toll, but emotionally, spiritually. I had spent 21 years in the military. I had saved hundreds of lives. I had also made impossible choices, carried the weight of every person I could not save, and sacrificed pieces of myself I was not sure I could ever get back. The nightmares started in 2018, not every night, but often enough. I would wake up in my apartment near the base, heart racing, seeing faces I had not thought about in years. Private Morrison, from my first week in Afghanistan, the children in that village school, the soldiers I had triaged, choosing who got treated first, knowing that choice might mean someone else did not make it. My therapist at Walter Reed said it was delayed PTSD, that I had spent so many years in survival mode that I never processed the trauma. Now that I was in a safer environment, it was all catching up to me. I did not want medication. I did not want to be labeled as damaged, so I coped the way I always had, by working, by staying busy, by not thinking too much about what I had been through. But in the quiet moments, alone in my apartment, I started to wonder what came next. I was 41 years old. I had achieved everything I had set out to achieve in the military, but I was not happy. I was not fulfilled. I was just tired, so I made a decision. In January of 2021, I submitted my retirement paperwork. After 23 years of service, I was leaving the military. Retirement was strange. For 2 decades, I had worn a uniform every day. I had a clear purpose, a defined role. Now I was just Clara Barton, civilian. I spent the first few months in limbo, staying with my brother Michael in Dallas. He had become a high school teacher, married with 2 kids. His life was normal, stable, everything mine had not been. He tried to help, but he did not really understand. How could he? He had not lived what I lived. In April of 2021, I decided I needed to start over completely. I needed a place where nobody knew me, where I could just be another person, not Colonel Barton with her decorated service record and controversial past. I chose Portland, Oregon, almost at random. It was as far from Texas and Washington, D.C. as I could get without leaving the country. I rented a small 1-bedroom apartment in the downtown area. Nothing fancy, just a place to sleep. Then I applied for nursing positions at several hospitals. I left my military rank off my resume. I did not mention my combat experience or the commendations or the controversy. I just listed my credentials: registered nurse, bachelor's degree in nursing, 20+ years of experience. St. Michael's Hospital called me within a week. The interview was straightforward. They needed experienced nurses for the night shift. I told them I preferred nights, that I worked well under pressure, that I was reliable. All true. They hired me on the spot. My first shift was in June of 2021. Walking into that hospital in regular scrubs, no rank insignia, no military bearing, felt like wearing someone else's skin. But I adapted. I learned the rhythms of the hospital, the personalities, the procedures. I kept my head down and did my work. My colleagues were friendly, but not invasive. Jenny, another night shift nurse, became something close to a friend. We would have coffee together during breaks, talk about television shows and weekend plans. She had no idea I had spent the previous decade in war zones. Nobody did. For 3 years, I lived this quiet life. I went to work, came home, read books, took walks along the Willamette River. I went to therapy once a week with a civilian counselor who specialized in veteran transitions. I did not date. I did not socialize much outside of work. I was healing, slowly, from wounds that were not visible but ran deep. Portland became my sanctuary. The rain, the green trees, the coffee shops, the anonymity. I could walk down the street, and nobody knew my story. Nobody expected anything from me except to show up for my shift and do my job. It was exactly what I needed. But peace, I have learned, is always temporary. You can run from your past. You can change your name and your city and your entire life. But eventually, your past finds you anyway. The morning Dr. Harrison asked me that question, everything changed. Within hours, the entire hospital seemed to know. The quiet nurse on the night shift was a retired Army colonel who had served in combat for over a decade. The reactions were mixed. Some people were impressed, even awed. The younger nurses asked me questions about what it was like, about the places I had been. Some of the doctors, including Dr. Harrison, treated me with a new level of respect, but others were different. Karen, a day shift nurse I had worked with occasionally, made a comment that stuck with me. So you have been hiding this the whole time? What, you thought you were better than us? It was not about being better. It was about being left alone. But I could not explain that without sounding defensive. The hospital administrator, Mrs. Patricia Donovan, called me into her office 3 days after the revelation. She was in her 60s, efficient and no nonsense. Clara, I want to be upfront with you. We did a background check when we hired you, but it was basic. Your military service was noted, but we had no idea about the extent of it. Why did you not disclose that you were a colonel? I met her eyes steadily. Because it was not relevant to the job I was applying for. I am a nurse. That is what you needed. My rank does not make me better at starting IVs or monitoring vitals. She studied me for a moment, then nodded. Fair enough, but now that it is out there, we have had some interest. The local news wants to do a story. The hospital board thinks it could be good publicity. The thought of being on the news, having my story told again, the controversy rehashed, made my stomach turn. With all due respect, Mrs. Donovan, I would prefer not to do that. I came here for a fresh start, not to relive the past. She looked disappointed but did not push. All right, but I do want to ask you something. Would you be willing to help train our emergency department staff? We have been looking to improve our trauma response protocols. With your experience, I hesitated. This was the line I had been trying not to cross. Staying invisible meant not using my military expertise. But another part of me, the part that had spent 2 decades training others to save lives, recognized the opportunity. Let me think about it, I said. Over the next few weeks, I watched how the hospital handled trauma cases. Portland was not a war zone, but it had its share of violence. Gunshot wounds, car accidents, stabbings. I saw procedures that could be improved, protocols that could save minutes, and in emergency medicine, minutes meant lives. I also saw how my colleagues struggled with the chaos. They were good nurses and doctors, but they had not been trained to work under the kind of pressure I had experienced. They got flustered, made mistakes, second-guessed themselves. I could help them. The question was whether I wanted to, whether I was ready to step back into that role of leader, trainer, expert, whether I was ready to stop hiding. It took me 2 months to make the decision. In October of 2024, I went back to Mrs. Donovan's office and told her I would develop a trauma training program for the emergency department. The news spread quickly. Some staff were excited, others were skeptical. During the first training session, I stood in front of 30 doctors, nurses, and paramedics. I was wearing scrubs, not a uniform, but I felt the weight of my past settling back onto my shoulders. My name is Clara Barton, I began. Some of you know me as the night shift nurse. Some of you know I served in the military. What you need to know is that I spent 13 years treating combat casualties in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. I am not here to tell you war stories. I am here to teach you how to stay calm, make fast decisions, and save lives when everything around you is falling apart. I taught them triage techniques I had learned in field hospitals, how to assess multiple casualties simultaneously, how to prioritize based on survivability rather than severity, how to communicate clearly under stress, how to control your fear so it does not control you. The training was intense. Some people thrived, others struggled, but by the end of the 6-week program, I could see the difference. The emergency department was functioning more efficiently. Response times improved. More importantly, the staff was more confident. Dr. Harrison approached me after one particularly difficult trauma case where we saved a young man who had been in a severe car accident. That could have gone very differently without your protocols, he said. You are making a real difference here, Clara. For the first time in years, I felt something shift inside me. I realized I had been trying to be someone I was not. The quiet, invisible nurse was never really me. It was a version of myself I created because I was afraid. Afraid of the scrutiny, the questions, the judgment. Afraid that if people knew who I really was, they would expect too much. Or worse, they would think the controversy defined me. But standing in that hospital, teaching others, seeing the impact of my experience, I understood something important. Both versions of me were real. The colonel who led soldiers in war zones and the nurse who preferred quiet night shifts were the same person. I did not have to choose between them. I am 45 years old now. I still work at St. Michael's Hospital. I still prefer the night shift, but I also run the trauma training program. I mentor younger nurses. I consult on difficult cases. I do not hide who I am anymore, but I also do not lead with it. My military service is part of my story, not the entire story. The nightmares still come sometimes. The weight of the lives I could not save still presses on me in quiet moments, but I have learned to carry it better. To honor those losses by making sure I am prepared for the next person who needs me. People ask me sometimes if I regret my decision to go to that village in 2012, if I would do it differently, knowing what it cost me. I always tell them the truth. I would do it again, because 28 people are alive who would not be otherwise, and that matters more than my career, my reputation, or my comfort. I am Clara Barton. I was a colonel in the United States Army. I am a nurse at St. Michael's Hospital, and both of those things are equally true. I do not have to choose anymore. I get to be both. That is my story, not just the dramatic moments or the controversies, but the quiet evolution of a person learning to accept all the parts of herself. Today, I do not hide who I was, but I also do not let it define who I am now. I am Nurse Clara Barton, and yes, I was also Colonel Barton. Both saved lives, both carry scars, and both believe that every life is worth fighting for. Now I want to hear from you. What would you have done in my place? Would you have hidden your past, or revealed it from the beginning? Leave your opinion in the comments. If this story touched you in any way, subscribe to the channel for more real stories that reveal what happens when the past meets the present. And do not miss the next recommended video, because there is another story waiting that will make you question everything you think you know about the people around you.